wonderful turnout of family and friends of the speaker who have journeyed here from miles away, from Madison, from Sheboygan. Anybody else from great distances that I haven't?
There we go.
All right. Well, our speaker tonight is Austin Scheid, who is a senior student in the Atmospheric Sciences program here at UWM. He's also the president of the Atmospheric Sciences Club in the undergraduate program. And Austin grew up in Sheboygan, graduated from Sheboygan North High School, and will be graduating from the program here in just a couple of weeks. And Austin has, this is part of his senior capstone project, researching the Southern Great Lakes Derecho of May 30th to 31st of 1998. I will say personally that this is a subject near and dear to my heart. I'm old enough to remember I was one of the meteorologists on duty when the warnings came out at 3 o'clock in the morning on May 31st for this storm system. And I will tell you it was one of the more frightening nights that I ever spent as a professional. It was the only night in my career that I called my family and woke them up in the middle of the night and told them to go downstairs to the basement. So my wife knew that something was wrong when I was making a call like that. And I just want to say in that vein, having had firsthand experience with it, I have been so impressed with the thorough job that Austin has done in tackling every angle of this storm event that I think could possibly be imaginable. So without further ado, Austin, you've got the floor. Thank you very much.
So good afternoon. May the 4th be with you, as I told Lindsay I would say, and of course guess who's not here. So I was tasked with researching the Southern Great Lakes Derecho of 1998, which was a significant windstorm that came through from Minnesota, Wisconsin, into Michigan, and on its way to the northeast. So some background information before we really start diving into the meteorology behind it. We must define what a derecho is. So a derecho is thunderstorm winds greater than 58 miles an hour and a damage path greater than 240 miles an hour. With the diagrams, we have the serial derecho as well as a progressive derecho on here. With this derecho itself, it was a little bit of both. So now, more background information on the event. As we talked about, we have a tornado outbreak in South Dakota that moves towards the Minnesota area, which then becomes a derecho as it moves through Wisconsin and into the northeast, before becoming a second derecho, or a second tornado outbreak in New York into the northeast. Alright, so now we need to talk about the forecast leading to the event. In all, the SBC did a pretty good job of talking about this well in advance. Unfortunately, they did not talk about it being derecho-like, but it's kind of hard to predict derechos, especially in 1998. So SBC at 2:55 a.m. on Friday started talking about the day 2 risk for the Dakotas, Iowa, Nebraska, and Minnesota. As we progress throughout the day, SBC begins talking about extreme instability and supercell thunderstorms with tornadoes being possible for the day 2. At 9:10 on Friday, the forecast discussion was calling for 2 rounds of severe weather. We have one in the morning on Saturday, and then we have one again in the afternoon and evening that would progress towards Sunday. Then at 12:54 a.m. Saturday, SBC issues a moderate risk of severe storms for South Dakota, Iowa, Minnesota, and western Wisconsin, with a slight risk extending out from there. So now, this is the part where I'm going to be doing a lot of talking. There's not a lot of information present on here. So, can everybody see this screen? Because this is where I'm more comfortable to talk about it. If not, I guess just bear with me. So, talking about this, the first part of it is we have a upper level disturbance that ends up moving through in the morning, which kicks off the early morning convection. After that, we start to see that there's an upper level jet that begins over the region and pushing towards the Dakotas, where we're talking about the primary risk of severe weather in the evening. We have a well-defined cold front. The dry line also kicks off through the Dakotas, and we have a warm front that's beginning to take shape into Wisconsin. There's extreme instability across the area, with 4,000 to 6,000 joules per kilogram in the area. Typically, you need about 1,500 joules to form a typical thunderstorm, so we're talking about double or triple that with this system. So for the Dakotas itself, we don't have the presence of the low-level jet, which usually will provide the perfect storm type of scenario, but it was present into Iowa and Wisconsin, and that will play a bigger role into the derecho itself. And the big scale feature with this, and why this system was able to do this and continue, was we had high pressure sitting over the southwestern part of the U.S., which created this flow for the upper-level jet to move over the area. We also had pretty strong shear in the environment, noted by the pink line, but that is really just more winds from two different directions that are possibly able to produce tornadoes, which we will see in the South Dakota region. Alrighty, so now talking about the morning storms. We had strong thunderstorms form around 2 in the morning on the morning of May 30th, which is this cell right here. For those of you who are looking this way, it is that cell right there. Too many screens right now. Thunderstorms continued into Iowa and Minnesota, and they did prompt a severe thunderstorm watch for Iowa that was later replaced by a tornado watch. As we continued through the morning, it did end up being canceled into the early afternoon as the real part of the event begins. So now we're going to take a look at the satellite imagery. Again, I'm going to go over here just so everybody, if you can see, if not, no big deal. So we do have the cold front across the area and the dry line. So as we saw in the last 2 slides ago, this is the area that we're talking about. We do have some convection beginning to form along the dry line, which will eventually progress towards areas marked B. We do have initiating convection, but nothing really comes from those storms in B. But as C moves towards B, we do start to see thunderstorms really evolve. And once we get towards Spencer, it will be a much different story. But we'll talk more about Spencer in the coming times. So now at the beginning of the actual event. At 3:30 p.m., the SBC goes ahead and issues severe thunderstorm watch number 467 until 10 p.m. The threats they were talking about was hail to 2 inches and thunderstorm gusts to 80 miles an hour. We do have pseudo-discrete supercells at this time across the area, and what we mean by that is, instead of just being discrete supercells where it's just one storm by itself, we ended up having 2, which can be noted right here, and for those of you who are looking this way, we have the 2 cells right here. As we continue to go forward, 20 minutes later, the SBC goes ahead and issues tornado watch for South Dakota, Minnesota, and Wisconsin until 10 p.m. The hazards were including tornadoes, hail, and T-storm gusts to 80 miles an hour. We did have now just one discrete supercell, which was moving towards a favorable environment, which allowed the SBC to go ahead and issue the tornado watch well in advance of this line of storms. The reason why they were able to go with it was the return of moisture to the area was sufficient, as well as the strengthening of the frontal boundaries across the area, which gave them high confidence that there was a risk of severe weather into the Minnesota area. So now, advancing a little bit further in time, you see the storms themselves have grown upscale. We're now starting to get towards a linear line, but we still have some pseudo-discrete supercells across the area. The hazards with this watch, the SBC was calling for large violent tornadoes, T-storm gusts to 80 miles an hour, as well as hail 3 inches in diameter. You might be wondering, the last slide had just a tornado watch, this is now a PDS tornado watch. What's the difference? Well, a PDS tornado watch is a particularly dangerous situation. And when talking about it, they only issue this if there is high confidence that large violent tornadoes will be possible across the area. In 1998, they did not really issue these watches very often. Typically, in 1998, there was 1, maybe 2 watches that were labeled PDS. In more recent times, we have evolved to use it a lot more, but just a little bit of the history of what PDS is. As mentioning earlier, the Spencer, South Dakota tornado. At 8:32 p.m., a tornado warning was issued from McCook County, South Dakota. And we're going to go back a slide here real quick. This is the cell that we're talking about right here that's moving towards Spencer. This storm had already produced multiple tornadoes, I believe it was 8 in all, along a 30-mile path that was nearly continuous. Reports were relayed from law enforcement in the Rotate 1998 project of strong rotation and reports of a large tornado just outside Spencer as we move towards 838. Unfortunately, this goes down as the deadliest tornado in South Dakota history and still stands today. 6 people did pass away, and we did have winds as high as 246 miles an hour, which unfortunately was right in downtown Spencer. 95% of the buildings in Spencer were destroyed, and Spencer to this day has not really been rebuilt. People have returned to the area, but it was kind of left until the early 2000s as just pretty much completely destroyed. And unfortunately, going forward, we're now going to be talking about much more damage coming through Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan, and off towards the northeast. So this is a radar loop of the event, and we're going to watch it play back here because it's kind of cool for me. You'll see it in South Dakota. And as it's going to begin to advance forward, you'll see it becomes linear, and then we're talking about the derecho event itself from Minnesota moving into Michigan. From my research, we stopped talking about it in Michigan because as it moved out, we start dealing with other factors that play into this storm, like the tornado outbreak and the return of moisture across the area. So now, at 9:30 p.m., the SPC issued tornado watch number 470 from Minnesota and Wisconsin until 4 a.m. on May 31st. Hazards did include tornadoes, hail, T-storm gusts to 80 miles an hour. And this was the first indication of a quasi-linear convective system, which all that means is we're moving away from supercells to becoming more of a linear feature on the map, which, as we'll advance forward, becomes more of a threat for wind gusts as we move throughout the night. So now we get into the more interesting part where we're actually starting to talk about derecho. The SPC is actively calling this derecho and putting warnings out of high winds likely across the area. So at 11:10 p.m., the SPC issued tornado watch severe thunderstorm watch number 471 from Minnesota and Wisconsin until 5 a.m., which is denoted by the yellow box right there. And again, the SPC was talking about this as a derecho itself as it was going out. And I know, unfortunately, technology in 1998 with radar images is not the kind that we enjoy with the nice HD we see today. But if you can kind of see here and on other ones, we do start to see along the warm front convection, and then we also have the system itself beginning to bow out. If you can't see it, after I'll show a closer image of it, I do have it on my flash drive. So now at 11:35 p.m., the SPC goes ahead and issues tornado watch number 472 for Iowa, effective until 5 a.m. The threat was for tornadoes, hail, and T-storm gusts to 80 miles an hour. And again, indications of now a strong derecho is ongoing and further developing across the region. To note here, and this is kind of more of an important point that will come up later, in 1998 they only had polygon technology, so you could only issue essentially this, a box for an area. And while doing that, unfortunately you end up warning too many people. The storms with this, they extended, basically we're going to hug the Illinois-Wisconsin border, but they ended up going all the way down with this. Again, unfortunately that's just a sign of the times. We did get better with this, and we'll talk more about that in the coming slides. So now, at 12:23 a.m., the SPC goes ahead and issues tornado watch number 473 for Wisconsin, Illinois, and Lake Michigan until 6 a.m. Hazards did include tornadoes, hail, and T-storm gusts now to 95. Now this is an important point because the last couple were talking about winds to 80 miles an hour. And as we were going through and storms moved through Minnesota, we finally at 12:23 start getting reports of winds going up to 90 miles an hour, so the SPC went 5 miles an hour higher, thinking that was as far as it was going to go. Unfortunately, they were not quite accurate with that, and as you'll see here in the next two slides, it does get much worse. First reports of significant damage come in at 1 a.m. in Minnesota, and unfortunately that is just going to be the continued trend through this of significant damage across the area. So now at 2:06 a.m., SPC goes ahead and issues another tornado watch number 474 for Michigan, Lake Michigan, and Lake Huron until 9 a.m. This in large part is where we're going to stop talking about the derecho, but it is important to note that it does continue on into New York, Pennsylvania, and the Northeast. It does produce still significant damage, and we will talk about the damage in those areas, but not so much the meteorology behind it, because it's a very different system than what happened in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Minnesota. So now hazards are tornadoes, hail, and T-storm gusts to 105 miles an hour. Again, we increased the total in winds from the SPC, and we're starting to get reports from western Wisconsin now to winds up to 100 miles an hour. Unfortunately, again, SPC goes a little low with this. We do start seeing winds even higher than this in southeastern Wisconsin. So now, damage from the event. In all, 60 tornadoes were confirmed from 2 separate tornado events, with 7 tornadoes greater than an F3. We have moved now in recent years to the enhanced Vegeta scale, just to note that there is a difference between the two. Thousands of wind reports and damages were confirmed from Minnesota to the East Coast, and we had major damage widespread across the Midwest and Northeast. So now we're going to talk about the 3 states in particular, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan, which were especially hard hit across the area. We had tens of thousands of trees blown over in Minnesota, which is kind of ironic because, you know, the land of 10,000 lakes, 10,000 trees. I think they just like the number 10,000, honestly. Sorry to my Minnesota friends in the room. Roughly 500,000 people were without power, and we did have 22 people be injured, with the strongest winds from St. Paul down towards Apple, with also winds being reported near 80 to 90 miles an hour as it continued. Damage from Wisconsin, it did continue to grow upscale as we moved through. So we had one death, unfortunately, in Wisconsin, where the person was asleep in their house, and as the storms came through, a tree fell on top of their house, and unfortunately resulted in a death. We did have 2 indirect deaths from it, from tree damage as well as the power grid being on, people trying to remove tree branches. Please don't do that, okay? That's not a good idea. 37 people were also injured, and don't pay too much attention to the property damage. I did my own research on it to actually come up with the real number, give or take from documents, because there was a wide range of what agencies reported. But as you can see, a significant swath of 100-mile-an-hour plus winds. The problem with this is many of the anemometers broke as it came through. So now that presents you with a problem. Do you take the last wind speed it reported, or do you now estimate going higher? Because clearly, you know, it broke at that speed. Could it have been higher? Some research suggests yes, the wind speeds were higher, as high as 140 miles an hour, and some research says no, 128 was a misreading of the instrument. From talking with the National Weather Service, who did the actual survey of damage, they came out and said yes, it was 128 mile an hour winds, and they are quite confident that's what happened. And the strongest damage was basically from Madison into Milwaukee and up towards Sheboygan and Fond du Lac counties. So now here's some pictures of the damage just to kind of get a scope of it. Again, I had to go to Madison to do this research, and it's microfilm, and this is 1998 pictures. You don't get the HD, so I'm sorry for those of you who are like, I can't really see what this picture is. I'll try to explain it. So here is a tree that was uprooted from the concrete that ended up falling on a house. The second picture ends up being a tree that fell and smashed the roof down on the area. Here's another picture of the damage from Wisconsin. This was first believed to be a tornado that came through, knocking down the barn as well as the house, but it was later deemed that straight line winds up to 120 miles an hour ended up just bulldozing the house essentially. So now getting into the damage in Michigan. Michigan also had significant winds, and as you can see, confirmed to 130 miles an hour. But again, we run into the issue of the anemometers broke. So again, these are just at that point where they broke, could have been higher, and much of the research suggests to 140 miles an hour. And across the area, you'll notice a lot of hundreds, which produces a lot of damage across the area. The areas highlighted in blue were federal disaster zones that were declared within 48 hours of the storms moving through, which is quite fast if you think about it, because typically it takes about a week to 2 weeks to actually get federal disasters being declared, and they got it within 48 hours. And then you're probably looking at that S on the map and going, what does that mean? Super wind? Is this something that we haven't seen before? No, it's not super wind, and I'm not even sure what that would be in terms of meteorology terms. But it's a seiche, essentially. Lake Michigan has a natural seiche. It oscillates back and forth with the high end being on one side and the high end being on the other side. Natural progression. But as the storm came through, you have winds to an 80 to 140 miles an hour pushing the water across Lake Michigan. As it continues to push it across Lake Michigan, eventually you're just going to run out of water. It has to go on land at some point. And as it came ashore in the Muskegon area, the seiche itself was 10 to 15 feet higher than what high tide was being reported at. So these are significant waves. In the report itself, it calls it a tidal wave. Please don't call it a tidal wave, it is a seiche. There is a difference between the two. So now, talking about damage estimates. Depending on what document you look at, depends on the number you get. So if you look right away at the bottom part, 300 million to nearly 600 million. This nearly 600 million is the number I came up with looking through FEMA documents, as well as a document that was given to me by Madison that annotated everybody's damage. 300 million was the low end reported by other agencies, so we went with the range just to kind of address that there is this whole research. Michigan came out with nearly $172 million in damage, And they probably have the best sense of humor I've ever seen in a report, where they come out and say, $172 million in damage, but the sun was shining the next day, so it wasn't really that bad. $172 million begs to differ. And then looking at Wisconsin, nearly $82.5 million worth of damage, bringing the grand total up to $591 million between all the states. In 2018, doing a currency comparison, it's nearly $500 million to nearly $1 billion in damage, which puts it on the scale of hurricanes. So now, the real question is, for many of you in the room, you're going to be like, yeah, this happened, but why don't I remember it? This was significant for most of us, and for those of us who work in weather, obviously we know a little bit more about this, and other people as well. But why do we forget? Well, the first part is the timing of the event itself. It started at 7 p.m. in the Dakotas. By the time we get to Wisconsin, it's already after midnight. And by southeastern Wisconsin, it's closer to 2 to 6 a.m. Another reason was it was a holiday weekend. Memorial Day is a big travel weekend across Wisconsin, as well as other states as well. Many people just went up north. If you're not here to experience it, did you really experience it? It's kind of that tree falls in the forest and nobody's there to hear it. Did it make a sound? Kind of the same thing here. Another reason why we forgot was 1998 itself was a very active year. We had the historic 100-year flood in Sheboygan that dropped about 10 inches of rain in a day. December 27th, June 27th, tornado outbreak in Derecho across Wisconsin again. There was many other derechos across the area in Wisconsin, many other windstorms as well. And another point to note about this was on Labor Day of that same year, we had another derecho come through the same exact area. It wasn't as bad as this one, but again, you just kind of start forgetting about it because now you have so many others you have to try to remember. 1998 itself was nicknamed the Year of the Wind by the media in the Midwest. And also, we have a snowstorm, as you can tell by little 1-year-old me in this picture. Dumping about 1 to 2 feet of snow across southeastern Wisconsin. It's really hard to try to keep straight all of these events that happened in 1998. So now, here's some pictures of the Sheboygan flood. This was before it really got bad, and this is my neighborhood where I grew up. Also, I'm sorry, Dad, we're going to have to point out, please don't walk in floodwater, okay? Not a good idea. Also, don't drive through floodwater as this car in the background sees. If you see high waters, turn around, please don't drown. We don't need more deaths from events. So what we learned in 1998, many NWS offices rose to the occasion by being properly staffed to handle this event. That was a really good thing. Radio, TV, and emergency alert broadcasts were also crucial in getting warnings out ahead of time for storms in most areas. There was a small subtle detail that we'll talk about in the coming slides that was not so great with that. Warnings came early enough to prevent significant loss of life and property damage, which was another good thing. So this won't end up happening in Wisconsin due to the smaller TV markets, but TV stations in large markets in South Dakota broke up warnings to specific networks so everybody had adequate coverage of the warnings across the Midwest. The reason why they're able to do that is most of these places have nearly 100 counties that are in their, jurisdiction, would that be the word? Yeah, so jurisdiction. So that's a large area you have to cover. And now if you have a line of storms, every county has a warning, and it's progressing east, how do you handle that in terms of now you have to tell everybody and treat every storm equally? They handled it nicely by breaking it up, which is a brilliant play for large markets. The smaller markets, we're not going to end up seeing that happen. And with talking about this, communication methods need to be improved in between government agencies. And what we're trying to get at with this is, you had the NWS saying, we have a derecho ongoing, this is an all hands on deck type of event. Fortunately, FEMA never got that call. Not a great time to forget that word. Emergency Management Office. That is what it is. Emergency Management Office never got that phone call saying, we have a chance of significant damage across the area. You should probably start preparing and getting warnings out for this. Never really got that call. And some regions across the area weren't adequately prepared to pass information along to emergency management. So they would issue it, and they would think that they got it. Unfortunately, it was never passed along. It just sat there. which was another problem that we learned in 1998, and we needed to start communicating better. What we also learned were fisheries were impacted by this as well with Lake Michigan, but the perch were more positively. More research is being done with this, and a paper featuring Professor Kuhl, Professor Aguilar-Diaz, Clark, and myself will be coming out hopefully soon. And what we learned from this was that there was an early bloom in plankton out across the area. It peaks, and then it comes back down. And what, unfortunately, with perch is they start hatching in June, right? Yeah. So they start mid-May?
Yeah.
Okay. They start hatching in mid-May. And as they start hatching, they want to go towards deeper water as they continue to grow. They need a food source. Unfortunately, as we start coming into the 26th of May, the food source isn't really there. But with our wind event here, you'll start seeing it comes through on the 30th and 31st. We start to see a significant growth in it as the winds essentially push everything out further, which was great for the perch. As you can see, the spawn from this starts to increase. We have 1998 in the initial year. In year 1, we don't have the measurement, but year 2, where we can start actually seeing the perch, we see a significant increase in perch count, and it continues through going forward. Now, why it's also relevant today in terms of the meteorology field is better communications came from the NWS and government agencies. And another great thing that happened from this was each individual storm doesn't need its own warning. The storm can be warned on a line. In 1998, the NWS had a rule where every county needed an individual warning for each individual storm. When you come into a line, that becomes an issue because now you're issuing a warning for every county along that line individually. That creates a problem of you're not going to get that information out timely or effectively. NWS goes ahead and breaks the protocol and ends up going through and just slapping a warning for the whole line. Expires at this time for these counties. And now today you end up seeing that being more commonly used for types of events like this. Another great thing that is relevant today with this is the NOAA weather radios. We really went with it after 1998 to properly give warnings out there ahead of time. If you don't have one of these, I highly recommend getting it. It's going to keep you safe, especially at 3 in the morning when a storm comes through that impacts your life. It's not worth it to sleep through it just to end up having a tree fall on you when all you had to do is go to your basement. And the reason why we bring this up is in South Dakota, they had a catastrophic failure of these weather radios in 1998. The cell tower that ended up issuing the warnings crashed. They also blamed an intern, so for those of you who've ever been an intern in the room, fortunately you just kind of get blamed for things. But the intern gets blamed, but then later they find out the cell tower that was broadcast ended up being struck by lightning and knocked down. Warnings were never able to be distributed, which brought, essentially for all of South Dakota, no warnings were ever presented on these radios, which unfortunately might have saved more lives than Spencer, but again, that's kind of hard to say because there was warnings out on it and other agencies did pick it up. So now, why it's relevant today? Cell phones, along with social media, allow people to get information in a moment's notice at your fingertips. Enlarge is a major improvement to getting warnings out there. That was a quote from Rusty Capella, who used to be the warning coordinator at NWS Sullivan, who is now retired. We're going to get to this point too here in a moment on tornado sirens. And it's relevant today because on Wednesday we did see this end up playing out. We regularly test these tornado sirens. It allows us the chance to make sure they work, so that way in events where this happens, we don't have to just sit there and be like, oh, I really hope these tornado sirens work, because otherwise, my bad guys, I guess, type of thing. Another thing, as for my friend Mark Baden here in this picture, we're able to cut into live programming. We're able to go ahead and cut into other TV shows to come out and get these watches and warnings out there to people so they are prepared for it. As Mark always likes to say, cutting into The Bachelor. So what we need to do better, and this again played out Wednesday, implementation of universal guidelines. It's not helpful if Milwaukee County sounds tornado sirens for tornadoes, Racine County sounds them for hurricane force winds and tornadoes, and then, as we saw Wednesday, Waukesha County sounds it for a thunderstorm. It creates too much confusion, and this was from Ben Schliessman, who is the Southeast Emergency Manager. across the area. He's in charge of the whole southeast Wisconsin. It creates a problem if you can't just sound it and have it be individual counties are up to make that own decision. If you leave it up to the counties, you're creating confusion. And on the part of the weather people who are preaching safety, sound them for tornado sirens, sound them for hurricane force winds. If you're going to go ahead and sound them for just a thunderstorm with not very strong winds, you're now creating an issue. Nobody knows if there's an actual tornado or not. And if there's an actual tornado and you just sound for thunderstorms, people aren't going to take it as an actual threat of a tornado. They're going to be like, oh, it's just a thunderstorm. I'm going to continue out my day. This creates a life-threatening problem and needs to be addressed going forward. Another thing of what we can do better is educating the general public. I hope people are better prepared, but they need reminders sometimes that this can happen. We got slapped in the face in 1998, and I hope we learn how this can happen here. And that was from, again, Rusty Capella. And what he's getting at here is oftentimes in southeastern Wisconsin, you'll hear it. You'll just walk up and down the street, and you'll hear college students being like, Lake Michigan protects us from tornadoes. We don't have to worry here. Nothing bad happens here. Okay, that's not the case. We saw that with, I think it was Kenosha, Racine in 2012. There was a tornado there. People say, oh, winds above 70 don't happen here. Clearly they happen here. It just takes the right weather events that end up coming together to create this. So to be prepared for these type of events is very important. And also another major thing that we need to start pushing is to have social media platforms push severe weather alerts out as the first thing people see. If you're talking about a nice cat video where there's an active tornado warning going on in the area, and a tornado warning is the last thing on the list that gets prompted because you don't look at that very often, now that's an issue. Because that warning being the first thing you see, just a little banner saying tornado warning from Milwaukee, everybody's going to be like, hey, there's a threat here. Maybe I need to take this seriously and find some more information. Or if you're seeing it the last, unfortunately, you might not get the warning in time. Or as often we've seen, warnings come out 3 hours later as the first thing people see on Facebook. That's not helpful. The storm's not here anymore. And now you're creating panic again. So here are my references of which I went through and helped form some of the opinions on this. I'd like to show some of the acknowledgments here. Bart Adrian for allowing me to do this talk, as well as many other people, such as my family, Mike Westendorf and Clark Evans. Special thanks to these people. They provided a lot of help for me. Also, when it became very stressful as well with school going on and getting everything else done, it was very beneficial to have these people helping in my corner. And again, special thanks to the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, AMS local chapter here in Milwaukee, as well as the Atmospheric Science Club for everything and every opportunity I've had. So with that, any questions?